Cool. So what I want to talk about real quick is I want to talk about my 2032 thesis, which essentially some of you might have heard before, but probably not as much detail as I'm about to go into. And for those that have never heard of it before, prepare to put your tinfoil hat on because, yes, I am kind of crazy sometimes, and this is one of those times. But I can't stop seeing what I think that I am seeing, and so I'm letting you know what I see, and maybe you see what I see, or maybe you think I'm crazy. Let's see. So if we think about the year 2032, a lot of things are happening in that timeline. First thing I want to point out is the demographic shifts that are happening in the United States of America during that time. And this is something that's for any audience, but because America has such a big fingerprint on the entire world, things that happen in America, will permeate throughout the rest of the world, for lack of a better term, right? So first thing I want to point out is those demographic shifts in America. So in 2032, you have to think about the age groups that will still be, that are around today, that will be around in 2032. And let me say that more clear. We have these different generations that all kind of think a little bit differently in America. We have the baby boomer generation, which is individuals that were born between 1946 and 1964. You have Generation X, which is a much smaller generation because the baby boomers got their hands on birth control, and they decided they weren't going to make as many people. So there's less people in the following generation from 1965 to 1980, which is the actual Generation X is what they're called in America. There's a whole lot less of them, and they've never been able to gather the same political power as the baby boomer generation, for the simple fact of political powers in democracy is based on numbers. And there never was enough of them to be more than the baby boomers. So the baby boomers, as a result of that, had an unhealthy time run as being the dominant force in politics. What happened before then is normally you'd have kids, right? About the same amount that you have, maybe a little bit more. And because you have a little bit more, you have them at a normal timeline, that next generation eventually hits a time where there's more of them in positions of power than you, and they take over and they get the baton passed to them. But because of the decisions that, whether it's positive or negative, that happened during the 60s, there was less people in the next generation that were born from 65 to 80, right? Generation X. So as those individuals get to a certain age, they become 17, 18, and 19, et cetera. There's all these baby boomers still around, way more of them than there is of any given time, especially in their early years, because somebody born in 65, right, and somebody born in 70, there's only 5 years of, baby making, if you want to say that, to put them in the workforce. And they're surrounded by a workforce of people that are just old. At the end of the day, way older than them. And that created a certain type of personality archetype that generation started to have of super independence. You'll find a lot of people from that generation that are super independent. They, might be more risk takers than normal because they had no choice but to be. A lot of different things that generation had the, unfortunate circumstance or fortunate circumstance, you want to say, that they had, is what it comes down to. So you have that group, and they're born 65 to 80. We're going to come back to them because they're very important in this process, because the way that generation was treated ends up creating the cascade of events that I'll get into in a moment. So keep them in mind, right? If you want to keep going down the rabbit hole with me, right? If not, maybe you already turned the video off. But if you're still here, you're listening to me, there's a lot to unpack there, right? So Continuing after that, there's another generation that comes after that generation, the young people born from 1981 to 1996, like myself, the millennial generation, which has a completely different life. And essentially, they come from, it's very interesting how they are brought up, because they come from two groups. The baby boomers that waited to have kids until they turned 40, right? And then you also have the Gen Xers that decide to go and have kids. Both end up creating the next generation, the millennial generation. And the millennial generation lives from 1981 to 1996, and they live with the results of what happens when the baby boomers stay in power for a really, really long time, right? So what happens in America is they have to live through, the rise of the dot-com boom and dot-com bust. They lived through 9/11. They lived through the Great Recession. And then they lived through these interesting sets of presidencies that we've had recently. They lived through all those things. That's the entire, adult life that they essentially have. And then you finally have the Gen Z generation, which comes after them from 1997, right? Or the end of 96, mid 96 to 2010. And then you finally have Gen Alpha that comes everybody that's born after 2010, up until now. So you have these different generations. So I want you to keep them in mind. Baby boomers, Gen X, right? The millennials, Generation Z, and Generation Alpha. Those are generations that we have in front of us. Now, if we look forward to 2032, let's look at what we have. The people born from 1946 to 1964 now are going to be on the high side, 86 years old, and on the low side, 68. So what does that mean? For the first time in American history, in a long time, the baby boomer generation is actually completely in retirement age, right? All of them. All of them are 68 on the youngest of them and 86 to the oldest of them, right? When 2032 comes. That's one thing, right? Second thing that we want to look at is, of course, mortality rates. Unfortunately, we know that, eventually we all have to, leave this earth. And a lot more of the baby boomers will no longer be with us as a result of, that continuing to happen. Now, so that group is going to continue to shrink, and their numbers are shrinking every single year, right? And so when we get to that stage, right, of time, they are going to be much more on a descent of, ceasing to be a powerful force in public life. Now we have Gen X, right? We have the Gen Xers that are now at that point going to be between the ages of 67, right, and 52. So they're going to be in their twilight years of their working years. Some of them are already going to be retired. A lot of them are still going to be working, but they're reaching that age. And there's an interesting thing about Generation X is that the majority of the people in Generation X aren't spread evenly throughout the years. They're actually focused in on a specific timeline that I want to point out is that the majority or the biggest group of them are going to be this subgroup of Gen Xers called the Zennials, the Zennial subgeneration, which are people that are born somewhere around 1976-ish, right? Going up to 1980-ish, right? That group right there, right? Because they got the most disgusting compensation package ever in the history of America. Let's look at it. Let's say you're born in 1979, right? That means you graduate college, 22 years old, 2001. What happens? Dot-com bust after the biggest economic expansion in American history, the 1990s. They think everything's going to be great. They're super sold on the Gen X generation, super sold on you're going to have Social Security for life. We paid off the World War II debt, blah, blah, blah. Things are going to be amazing. Y2K, we just overcame that. That was nothing. We just had this new thing called the internet. You're going into the work field. It's going to be wonderful. Boom. Big boom. And a big bust that happens immediately. Then there's a big economic run-up shortly after that they start to get themselves into or whatever as property values continue to increase. So some of them got the benefit of getting in on some of that. But property values continue to increase, et cetera. But at the same time, there's also all this war and stuff that's happening with America, right? All that's happening. That's what they're coming into the workforce experiencing. And also, they're also being bombarded with a new tool every single week. They don't know if the internet's going to really become a thing. They don't know if it's not going to become a thing. They don't know anything, right? They're young, and they're just trying to make things work. And they're slowly figuring out that all the rules that were in place before 2000 no longer apply. And there's all this new stuff that they just got to figure out because it was probably the worst time to graduate from college, right? They graduate college. They get in. They get into the workforce. They're learning all these new tools. They think that, we just had a big economic bust. That's not going to happen again. And lo and behold, Great Recession at their core earning years where they're supposed to be the most stable in their life. They turn 30, guess what? Great Recession, here you go, right? All the stuff that you've been working on that you thought was going to be okay, no longer is okay, right? And at the same time, that's when the millennials join the workforce, right when that happens. And they tell the millennials, man, I don't know, 8 years ago something happened again. I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you. Stuff is just bad, right? And they rightly are a little bit upset. The other piece about that is they vote, and their votes don't tend to matter as much if you just think about it numerically, because even if you took all of the of-age Gen Xers at that time, right, that could vote, right, they are so small as a generation, they don't even reach the numbers of the baby boomers. So whatever the baby boomers vote for is what the heck is going to happen, right? And so they start to feel disenfranchised, in the grand scheme. And they have a very different way of thinking than the baby boomers because of them reaching the workforce at that exact time that they reached it. So they're saying all these ideas. They're trying to do this, trying to do that, and nobody's listening. And their votes don't change anything. Doesn't like it's actually a very interesting thing that probably nobody thought about when they said, let's just have less people. Okay, well, what happens if you make less people? When those people grow up and you live in democracy, guess what? That means you're going to have a big disenfranchised population of people that their political efforts don't really move anything. Very, 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 crazy situation there. So essentially that happens, right? So now you have the Gen Xers that went through that, the Zennials, right, that went through all of that, and pretty much if just had despair happen their entire adult life. So so the people that did make it had to make it by just being crazy, maverick, start a business, buy 3 houses, figure it out, maybe file bankrupt, who knows? But they figure stuff out and they turn into a certain, radical individual type of thinking, right? Which is good for the individual, but in order for any nation to survive, there needs to be some collective synchronization between thoughts and some patriotism to a certain extent in order for things to work a little bit. Not over super crazy, I don't know, actually, let me not even do that. Not going to get too political, but there needs to be some of that. And this actually creates a rift that occurs, right, with that particular group. So as we continue, then we have the millennials, which I've already mentioned, but there is a lot of millennials. A lot of freaking millennials. Because like I said, the Gen Xers had babies, and guess what? The baby boomers finally decided to have babies too, right? Whether it was their 3rd or 4th kid or their 1st kid, they had babies later, right? Because technology gave them the ability to be able to do that. So there's plenty of millennials. The millennials join the workforce, and they also get a lot of political power really fast because there's a lot of numbers. And you know what they do? As their first order of business, they vote in President Barack Hussein Obama, right? Becomes president of the United States. And that happens. Yes, we can. All these different things, right? Don't want to even get into all that, but I just want to point out that because that group was able to tip the scales, they were able to help him get elected as president, right? Now, fast forward, we get to 2032, what's happening? You have the baby boomers shrinking. You have the Gen Xers that are in their older years, which are normally the times when you want to, set up legacy and stuff like that the most, right? But a lot of them are going to get older as well. And you have the baby boomers not the baby boomers, but the millennials who are in the prime earning years of their life at that point in 2032. They're going to be between 36, right? And at the oldest, they're going to be hitting 50. So they're going to be at that core time when people expect you to be the unk with all the wisdom to impart on the next group of people coming up to learn the things, right? That's where the millennials will be at that point, right? And then you have the Gen Z coming directly after them and even Gen Alpha, which at that point, you're going to have people right now that are in middle school that are going to be 22 years old in 2032. And there's a lot of them too, because people started having babies, right? The only group that is really small is the Gen Xers, comparatively. So with that being the case, right, and we have all of that occurring, right, what does that really mean? That means that all of these generations that come from the latter half of the Gen Xers all the way forward have lived in a world in America where there's been economic trouble after economic trouble, where there's been technological advancement after technological advancement, right? And that they've had that essentially from the Zennials on have had technology at their fingertips their entire adult lives and further down the pipeline. For example, the Zennials, from the moment they graduated from college, they've had to have a computer in front of them, right? That's the way the world they've lived in, because they came out in the dot-com boom. Generation, the millennials, right? They grew up, and as soon as they became old enough to care about stuff, social media and Web 2.0 blew up, right? When I was, Facebook, I was one of the first users on Facebook. One of the first couple thousand users on Facebook, claim the fame, right? Not really, but I was one of the first couple thousand users on Facebook. And I was like 16 years old or something like that. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but for my entire adult life, there's been social media, right? And then you have the Gen Z, not their entire adult life. They've never lived in a world where you couldn't Google and get information at a moment's notice. And Gen Alpha has never lived in a world where you can't chat GPT to get an answer, right? So this is the technological progression. Each one of these groups of people is going to innately think differently and think about information and sharing and the global economy and the way that we interact with other nations and all this stuff like that completely differently than the baby boomers did. And the baby boomers finally will lose their grip on the electoral college because of their numbers, because there will be far more of all those generations than there is baby boomers. And the first time that really truly happens in a large amount is 2032, right? And we have an election that year. So then the question then becomes, what world will we live in after that 2032 election? I don't know. But it's the first time, right, where the group that has been in power for as long as they've been in power, right, will not actually be able to physically ensure their interests are made unless they indoctrinate enough people to think the way that they think, which I think is going to be increasingly hard, right, with all this open information that is out there. So then it becomes, just like there was the shift that happened in the 60s and in the 80s that the baby boomers made happen. The baby boomers made the Reagan years happen. The baby boomers made, right, the 70s happen because of their voting power, right? And what's going to happen in 2032 when now the millennials And Gen Z, the Zennials, and Gen Alpha are able to shape America in their own image because they have the numbers to do so if they choose to vote. What are the things that they want to occur? What are the things that they don't want to occur? What changes for the better can they actually create? Are they going to create a better world or a worse world? They get to decide that, right? It's going to be up to them to make that decision. And it's going to be very interesting to see what occurs. So there's always these big watershed moments in every single nation at different time frames that go around and become famous. But 2032 is going to be one of those times. Now, that's just the demographic piece. What about the technological piece? So there's this thing called the AI singularity, which I don't want to get too deep into right now, but that's the point where AI, in and of itself, can think at the same level of depth of the average human being, right? And right now we might think AI is smarter than us, but it's really not, because there's a lot of things it can't do. But that's no longer going to be true once the AI singularity occurs. And the AI singularity is very firmly established that we are going to reach it in around 2029, 2030, around that time. So 2032 will be the first American election post the AI singularity, right? And the reason why the AI singularity occurs is the human brain and eye, for example, I can't remember the exact number, but it takes like 10 to the, like 12th or 13th amount of cycles for the human brain to be able to look at two individuals and differentiate one person from the other person, right? That's how much it takes to do that. And the average computer that the average human being has in front of them can't operate at that level. Like the average laptop can't do that. Need a supercomputer to do so. But once we get to that stage, the average, $800, $1,000 laptop in today's money is going to be able to operate at that level, which means that AI models will be able to operate on that infrastructure in the palm of somebody's hands at all times. So it's literally going to operate at that level and being able to do things that we can only imagine what it will be able to do based on what it can do right now. You get where I'm going with that? So this is so with that type of technology, right? Hopefully we will have done enough governance law and stuff like that to properly steward that technology. But if we haven't, the first time where it's now not just like a thought we might need to do, it's going to be the first time where we're going to have to vote to really make it happen, because we're going to truly be able to get human-like intelligence from machines. And what does that look like? I don't know. We'll have to find out in 2032, right? So that's happening. Another financial thing that's happening as well is we might see the de-dollarization of the entire world. That's a very big possibility. I'm not going to get too much into that, but I will point out one thing that's going to happen in 2032 is the most significant Bitcoin halving. For those that don't hate Bitcoin, I don't know what to tell you. You're in the minority as of now. But Bitcoin, every 4 years, goes through this cycle where the block reward for somebody successfully mining a block, right, halves in number, which puts pressure on the price because you're creating less new Bitcoin every block that is created on the blockchain, right? So supply goes down because less new Bitcoin is being created, less available supply, I should say, right? So less available supply, and that ends up changing the price, which is why that mechanism was made with Bitcoin from the beginning. And that's why you see these big, gigantic super cycles in Bitcoin every 4 years, where the price just does astronomical numbers that you're like, why did it do that again? Why is it so much more money? Because that is built into the system, right? For it to do that, that's literally working by design. And the most significant halving happens in 2032, because that is going to be the first time where the Bitcoin block reward is going to be less than a single Bitcoin every single time you mine a block. You're not even going to get one Bitcoin for successfully mining a block. which is going to cause two things. One, the regular pressure that we already receive is going to happen, but also there's these things that happen when you're a trader, right? Which I happen to be. I do a lot of trading, right? The psychological levels, right? Psychologically, when something costs $1.25, you think about it a lot differently than when it costs 96 cents, right? You even think about 99 cents a lot differently than you think about $1.05, even though they're not that big of a difference. When you see the block reward go from more than one to less than one, there's a psychological shock that occurs when you realize how much less that you're receiving, which is going to cause more people to hoard their the Bitcoin that they have, plus the already supply shock that's happening because less is being created, which is going to cause the price of Bitcoin to do numbers like it's never done before. So that happens in 2032. So you have all of these things happening at the exact same time. You have the pressure from the markets in general, but the Bitcoin market in 2032, you have the pressures from the AI singularity, you have the pressures from the demographic shifts in America, all converging in 1 year at the same time. And that's not even everything I could say. I could say more. But all that happening at the same time, so what then should you do? I don't know, just be prepared. But a couple things that you should learn is maybe learn a little bit more about AI because the growth of it is inevitable, right? Also, maybe buy some Bitcoin because I guarantee you, actually, I can't guarantee you anything. Can't give you financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. But if you had $1,000 of Bitcoin today, I bet you it's worth a lot more in 2032. That's all I'm going to tell you, right? Do what you want with that information. And then also, with those demographic shifts, really think about if you're an American, right? What do you want the world to look like post 2032? And you have the power to go in and vote that into existence with a group of people that are more philosophically probably aligned with the way that you think, already as it stands now. And we might be able to remove some of the partisan, only two-party discourse that we have now and actually have real discussions about the way that we want the country to move forward. So with all those things in mind, prepare yourself because change is coming in 2032 in America. And by default, all of the countries that partner and do things with America, change will inevitably come to you as well by way of what's going to happen in 2032. And there's really no way around it. No matter what, it's going to happen and, prepare for it before it happens. It's better to be prepared than be unprepared. So do what you want.